Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today on our webinar, Security in Microsoft Teams, Looking Beyond, featuring our special guest, Thijs Lecomte. My name is Ivan, and I'm a sales manager here at Syskit, and today we are joined by Thijs, our star of the day, and my colleague Hervé, who will be showing you a demo of Syskit Point. Many of you already know us as a company, but for those who don't, let me briefly introduce you to Syskit. Syskit is a software development company founded more than 13 years ago. We develop products for Microsoft 365 governance, security, and auditing, as well as for SharePoint on-prem administration. We currently have more than 3,000 customers around the world. We offer 4 products, including our famous SP Docket for SharePoint on-prem documentation, as well as Syskit Point for Microsoft 365 governance and management. Before we start, just a few housekeeping rules. All registrants will receive a recording of the webinar within a few days. After Thijs' presentation, we'll have a short demo of Syskit Point, showing how it can help secure your M365 environment. After that, we will have a Q&A session where Thijs will answer any questions you may have. And please use the Q&A function on the right side of the screen to ask your questions throughout the webinar. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce you to our special guest. Thijs Lecomte is a passionate security consultant who works at the Collective Consulting as a senior Microsoft 365 consultant. He focuses on securing the environments of customers by using Microsoft security products. Thijs was recognized with a Microsoft MVP award in the Enterprise Mobility category. He's also active in the Microsoft Tech community to spread knowledge and help other people, sharing insights and tips on topics ranging from Microsoft Endpoint Manager to Microsoft Sentinel and Logic apps. So without further ado, I will now give a warm welcome and turn things over to Thijs. Thijs, are you ready?
Yes, thanks a lot, Ivan, and thanks for that wonderful introduction. So we're going to be talking about security in Microsoft Teams, but we're not going to be looking at what is the configuration in Teams, because for me, it's important to know that Teams is part of a large environment and a larger product, and what you're doing outside of Teams and the rest of your Microsoft 365 environment will also affect your security in Teams. So it's important to look just beyond the regular Teams portal. You need to look at the entire product SKUs to be aware of what the security is within Microsoft Teams itself. So Ivan already did a wonderful introduction, so I'll keep this quick. My name is Thijs, I'm from Belgium. I work day in, day out with the security products, and I run our internal security operations center, which is entirely focused on security using Microsoft Cloud products. And I'm indeed a Microsoft MVP because of my blogging, which I do, as you can see on the website. So we'll just dive right into it and get into technical. What I want to showcase is this maybe complicated graph, showcasing what it looks like, what the different steps are of a modern day attack. Because for me, it's really important that an attack already also has different stages. And this will also mean that your security has to be done in different stages. And that's a shift from the last couple of years. And that's not something new I'm selling, of course, but that's really important throughout this presentation is we used to have the firewall, big firewall on premises in the office, protecting everything. And that was one of the only things stopping bad attackers coming in. And once it got past that, they essentially had access to the entire environment. But as you can see, an attack comes into different stages, and we begin from the left-hand side of the screen from reconnaissance, which means discovering what is in there, to initial access, dropping a phishing email, going to Teams, dropping a malicious chat message, having a website which is vulnerable. And from there, moving laterally in the environment and going further and further. And this showcases security is not one thing, it moves further. And so to dive really into this graph, what do we see? Well, of course, we have the initial access, which is still important. That firewall that we have previously, that's still important. It shifted a little bit. It's not per se a firewall on premises. It could be in the cloud. It could be in a SaaS product or a PaaS product like Teams, like SharePoint, like Outlook Online, Exchange Online. So it differs, but the initial layer is extremely important. But what is the fact is we cannot be guaranteed that all of the attacks, all of the threats will be stopped within initial access, and we need to look beyond. And if they would go through the first set of defenses, they have to get through the second, the third, and so on. That's what we also see. If they have initial access, for example, they were able to send a malicious email through the anti-spam filter, they will have to deliver the malware and exploit and run it. So this means running on the machine, running it locally on the machine. Of course, they don't care about one single user in a company without much privileges. They will pivot, they do discovery, what is in here, what is in this environment. Do I see a local admin account? Do I see a domain admin with an easy password? And they try to move laterally in the environment. So this graph is just to showcase an attack has multiple stages, and we need to be able to make sure that in each stage we have additional protection in place. And this also showcases that within teams, we also have a multi-layered approach of security, and also showcasing this slide. It kind of reiterates what I told before. So we have the different stages of an attack, and here we just have the different layers in security. What do we see? Well, we have identities, which are, of course, the users logging into identity security, multi-factor authentication, a strong password. We have the security of the devices, the security of the applications, the data. So it's really the Word and PDFs and Excels saved, and of course, the underlying infrastructure. And if we map that to the different products that we have within the Microsoft stack, we can see that this is not only focused on just Teams, but all of the things we see right here are also applicable to team security. Because, for example, the data, well, the data might be residing in Teams, but it doesn't mean all data is equal. So if you're going to put additional restrictions really specific into Microsoft Teams and the data, and have a restriction for the type of data you have in there, you don't have enough with Microsoft Teams as a whole. You need to look further into, for example, Microsoft Information Protection or Purview. So this again showcases the multi-layered approach, which means we cannot only focus on one thing, we need to have the holistic view of the entire environment before we can move forward. But of course, it doesn't mean that security in Teams and in the Teams admin center is not important. For example, right here, I have done 4 controls. I have put 4 controls on the screen, which are really a must-do for every Teams admin to look into. And of course, these are 4 random controls. It's not that with these 4 controls, the environment is safe, but it showcases that there is a few bullet points on what to focus on. So first of all, teams creation, that's something that's also always coming back, is who can create a team. Is this a security risk? Yes, in a sense, because you don't know who is creating the team, what data they're putting into it. Do you have adequate security controls if suddenly you have high confidential data in a team with a guest, for example, in that team? So teams creation and limiting that is something which is often done. And of course, you don't want to hinder the entire creation of any teams, because that hinders the productivity, but you might want to have some few restrictions in place, a few policies in place, that you can make sure that you have that team's creation in a secure manner. Same with guest access. Of course, we want to have guests in the team because that's how we can collaborate, that's how we can be productive, but that's also dangerous, of course, because if we open it up all over the place, and if, for example, I invite a guest, and that guest can invite another guest on himself, that's dangerous, because then they can just pivot and add and share the data with people who you don't have given permissions to. That's actually a default setting where a guest can invite another guest. So guest access within Teams, it's really important when we're talking about security. Of course, app permissions. What do we mean by app permissions? Teams has a large ecosystem with a lot of vendors developing on top of Teams and providing additional intelligence. We can, for example, have a Jira Atlassian, the service desk tool, integrating within Teams and have that as an app where it's all integrated. We can have Azure DevOps, we can have Syskit, All of these can be integrated, and these are the correct examples I have shown you where there is a valid business case. But there's also so much apps out there which you probably don't want to use, which have so much shadow IT, which might be a storage provider like Dropbox, but you're standardized on OneDrive, for example. So managing who can use which applications is extremely important. And also, of course, meeting policies might not seem that apparent, but it's looking into who can join a meeting and what are the steps to join the meeting. Most of us use just the regular lobby feature, and that's great, but it's also in terms of educating the end users. To showcase an example, I was in a meeting with a customer who was rolling out Teams, and we were talking about meeting policies and a queue where you had a virtual queue you had to wait in before you were admitted in the lobby. Their manager was at that point on vacation and couldn't attend the meeting, and that's why he was absent. So what I did is I joined the meeting with that manager's name, and in seconds he was admitted into the meeting without the people thinking, okay, why is this manager who's currently on vacation joining the meeting without having a valid account as a guest? And they just let him in without thinking. So it's also meeting policies is extremely important because not all users think about who they let into the meeting. And of course, this can be if this is an informal meeting, it doesn't matter, but some of the meetings are confidential. So that's why important to look into those as well. So these are just 4 pointers, but of course, these are all specific for Microsoft Teams and will be configured within the admin center of Microsoft Teams. What we're going to be looking at throughout this webinar is really what's beyond and what are we looking at if we're looking at the entire scope. So not only Teams, but also entirety of Microsoft 365. One of that, of course, is administrators. Because administrators will define who can configure settings, who can remove teams, create new teams, add new members, add new owners. Administrators have a huge impact on your team's infrastructure. But here again, it's not only team specific, you have to look beyond the regular admins because we have different settings in teams because, for example, we have teams owners. An owner of a team has certain privileges over its own team. He can add and remove members and even delete a team. That's the first step of administrator, which is often forgotten. Who are the team's owners and do they know the impact they have? But then we have the different layers. For example, we have teams owners and then we have the admins. So these are really teams administrators. We have a team administrator role, we have a communications administrator, we have a communication support specialist. All of those different roles can be assigned to administrators to work on teams within the Teams admin center. So while the Teams owners are specific to everything within Teams, the Teams admins are within the Teams admin center. A step higher, which means higher privileges, we have security admin and user access administrator. And these, of course, have a high impact because the security admin can block access to Teams entirely or update certain settings to make sure that it's you have to have additional verification before you can enable. And user access administrator will be able to create accounts and link those to existing teams. And then finally, we have global admin. Of course, global admin is the biggest role out there. That's the domain admin from on-premises. So this has a huge impact on teams. And what is the meaning of this slide? As you can see, there's different levels of permissions. I need to be aware of all the level of permissions that you can have in Microsoft Teams, but they're also talking about least privilege. And it's just important to have a least privilege way of providing administrator roles to the admins. And that's also where something like privileged identity management comes in, where we don't assign a role actively, where the user has that role all the time, but he can request a role. And that's a great way to have least privilege is by using privileged identity management. We can make certain set of roles available and the admin can activate the correct role he needs, which means if I'm just creating a new team or updating something in the call queue, I enable the Teams administrator. But if I need to update domain settings or update conditional access policies, I might need to have security admin. So it's important to know what is the least privilege admin for a specific role, so you always go least privilege, and also the impact that other roles can have on your team's admin. Because as a Teams administrator, if you only have access to Teams, you need to be aware that other admin roles can also have an impact on Teams, either directly in the admin center by updating settings without your consent, or by moving around and creating policies around Microsoft Teams, which might block access for certain users. Blocking access for users is, of course, really important, and this goes into access control, who can access Microsoft Teams and how. Because by default, Azure AD is insecure in the sense that it will enable any user to log in from anywhere, any device, any place, any time, with just a username and password. That's the default configuration, which is great from a productivity standpoint, because then everybody can work as they want, where they want, and not hindered at all. But while I work at a SOC, at a Security Operations Center, we just see attacks on attacks on attacks of trying to log in into an account. So protecting the identities is probably the most important thing you need to do. And this is where we have conditional access coming in. With conditional access, we can create certain policies, certain rules, which will dictate if a user can access and how he can access. And this means what we can do is we can use certain conditions, like the user and the location, device he's coming in from, or the application he is accessing, and saying allow access, block access, or require multi-factor authentication. So conditional access is a really important feature within your entire security of Microsoft 365. And I have a few tips on how to get started and which conditional access policies to provision. So here I have 4 recommended policies, which might be just normal for you, but some of them might not be that normal because you might not think about that. But for me, these 4 are must-haves, and every environment should have those configured, because this will ensure you are maintaining control over the data and which users are accessing it from where. So first step, the first one, require MFA. That's a no-brainer. If you don't have MFA at this time, you should not doubt and just do that, because the amount of attacks and account breaches I have seen, either through a phishing mail or just through a brute force, is just too high. An account without MFA at this time is just a sitting duck, and it's only a matter of time before it will be breached. Besides MFA, we have legacy authentication. I hope you're all aware of legacy authentication. It's the old way of authenticating, and it's just using username and passwords, and it doesn't support any multi-factor or second factor authentication. So of course, legacy authentication, it doesn't support MFA, so we don't want it. And also it's heavily used within brute force attacks. Brute force attacks are typically being used with legacy authentication. So legacy authentication is something you should disable. Every organization should have done it by now, because Microsoft will be actively blocking it for Exchange Online. One tip I want to give you, Microsoft is blocking it for Exchange Online, not for entirety of Microsoft 365. But in my opinion, it doesn't matter, and the organizations should take responsibility itself and make sure that you block legacy authentication, not only for Exchange Online, but for the entire environment. So these 2 no-brainers. The last 2 might be a little bit more difficult to implement. And one of them I want to showcase is multi-factor configuration. What do I mean by that? By default, if a user is required to do MFA, but he hasn't configured the valid MFA method, he will be prompted to do so, which means the first sign-in the user does, he will be required to configure multi-factor authentication. But imagine if the user never logs in. For example, it's a dormant account, and the password of that account is breached. If I, as the attacker, will log into that account, I will have a valid username and password, I will log in, I will be prompted for MFA, but if I don't have that MFA method configured, I, as the attacker, can configure the MFA method on my own device, my own phone, for example, and log in with a valid MFA method. So that's why it's important to look further and to restrict where the MFA can be configured. And I like to restrict that based on devices and locations, and restrict it to only your corporate offices and your managed devices, which means if there would ever be a breach of, for example, a user account which does not have MFA configured, the attacker will not be able to log in because he will not be able to configure MFA. And that's a big one, in my opinion. Not a lot of organizations have configured it, but just requiring conditional access, requiring MFA is not enough, because if an account is inactive, dormant, or isn't being used, then he will not have MFA, and anybody can configure MFA on his own name. So restricting where you can configure MFA from is a big one. And the last one is also really important. By default, anybody can sign in with his corporate accounts on personal device and use the Outlook app, the OneDrive app, the Teams app, sync as much data as they want, and then they can just quit the next day. Their account will be suspended, their device will be delivered back into the office, but they still have all that cached data on their personal device. And that's a default behavior. Anybody can use a personal device to cache the data, have that running locally on the device, quit the next day, and they have the data on their local device. So with conditional access, we can scope a policy, not just through the entire access, but when data is being cached through a client app, so a mobile desktop. And with that configuration, we can restrict that sort of caching can only be done from managed devices, which is a really important one because it makes sure that you are still the owner of the data and have complete control over it. Moving further into that data, of course, not all data is equal. We have confidential data, we have public data, we have personal data, and it all depends what type of data you have on how strict you want to go with it. And this is where we have an entire new set of products, is where we have Microsoft Purview. Microsoft Purview old name is Microsoft Information Protection, and Microsoft Information Protection used to be Azure Information Protection. So lots of hubs here, if anybody is still with me, but Microsoft Purview is really meant to secure the data and to have a distinction on this is confidential data and this is public data. And there will be different policies and restrictions based on the way the confidentiality you assign to a document. What is important here within Teams is that we actually can assign a label to a team. So what does this mean? We can have a container level sensitivity label, and this label we can assign to a team. And this means I create a team in my Microsoft Teams and I will assign it at that time. Really important note, this label you assign will have no impact on the files that you upload in Teams. It is meant to secure the team as a whole. What can we do with that team level sensitivity label? Is there's two options we can do. One is we can restrict guest access. What does this mean? Imagine if I create a team I create a team and I assign the label highly confidential. That team will not have the option to add guests, because in a highly confidential team, yes, they should have only internal people because it's lots of secret information. So we want to restrict guest access, and this is a great way of restricting guest access, but in a smart way, because you can have black or white. Within Teams admin, you can say, yes, I want guests, or no, I don't want guests, but different teams will have different requirements. And through those container level labels, we can actually say, this team can have guests because there's no secret information, but this team with all the confidential data, we do want to restrict guests. So container level labels can be used for guest access, but also conditional access integration. Remember, I talked about restricting where data can be downloaded on through conditional access on what device. That's also black or white, meaning at that time, I'm saying you either don't have access to SharePoint data on a personal device or you do. but it doesn't matter which SharePoint site, it's all of the SharePoint sites, which is again, really black or white and not ideal. Not all data is equal. And through such a label, again, what we can do is we can decide this team with all of that confidential data can only be accessed from managed devices, from corporate devices, while this team with all of that public information can be accessed. And again, these container level labels are a great way to make sure that the security is applicable to all of the teams who require it, but you don't hinder the users by having this as a default option. So while we have the security within the teams itself, what is also really important, of course, is the chat feature. And phishing emails are ever apparent, and everybody knows about that. But what is also really dangerous is the Teams phishing attack. And that's something which we see upcoming more and more and more, because the default configuration is every user should be able to chat with everybody on the internet. The downside is anybody can create a Microsoft Teams tenant free through a trial, activate it, and begin sending links to everybody in our organization. What is the real downside here is users don't realize this, and when you receive a Teams message, you are more likely to interact with it compared to an email, because users are trained email are bad, email is bad, email is bad. When I see an email, I should think about it and don't click on any links. But when I ask you the question, how many of your end users will think about a URL like this and not click on it? This is a real up and coming danger, and you should be prepared for phishing through Teams. Now, how can we mitigate this? We have a couple of options. And the first one is, in my opinion, the biggest one, that's Teams Save Links. Through Defender for Office 365, we can have save links, which means that the links which are being sent in Teams and opened in Teams are being actively scanned. So they're opened in a sandbox to see, is this malicious or not? But we can also track the URLs and block certain URLs from being opened. And this is where you should be aiming at as the first step, to try to have insights which URLs are being used within Teams, but also the ability to block malicious URLs if needed. What is another option is federation and limiting who you can chat with. Personally, I'm not a fan of this, but I see companies moving to this more and more, and that's limiting who an organization can chat with. By default, I can open up my Teams and chat with every organization out there, but you can restrict from whom users can receive Teams messages. And that's one way to lock it down, to make sure that not random users are sending phishing links through Teams messages to the organization, is you can limit only these domains can send URLs to my users. And this is one way to secure the environment, because it restricts who can send. It will probably be the best solution out there. And I'm personally not a fan of this, because you restrict the productivity of an end user. That's why I'm also trying to focus on user awareness. It's not only talking about phishing message, not only talking why is an email bad, but also talking about Teams messages and how can we identify a malicious Teams message, and what should we do if we receive a malicious Teams message. And that's also something that phishing simulation campaigns and products are looking into. You have some products like GoFish, which will send emails as a test to see, does the user click on it, educate the users. Some of those products are also integrating with Teams to test the awareness of your users in Teams, which is a great way to make sure that users are aware of the dangers of Teams phishing. But of course, we won't be able to protect everything. Some things will go through, but that's where we really go into the auditing department. And with auditing, we can see what's happening. Because for me, if you just set up Microsoft Teams, there's always auditing in place, and you have the Office logs to be able to view all of the activity which is happening. This is something you should be looking into and you should be aware of, just because then you know what's happening and what's happening within the environment. Who is suddenly deleting all those teams, deleting all those documents, uploading a bunch of documents, suddenly mass downloading an entire team onto an unmanaged device. These are things you want to see. And for me as a Teams admin, you should be looking at two levels. One of them is Azure AD, of course, it's sign-ins, whether they're malicious sign-ins, are they using MFA correctly? Are these users signing in legitimately, but also SharePoint and Teams activity? Because of course, Teams, that's backed up by SharePoint because the files we put into Teams are stored on SharePoint, and we can monitor what is happening on both SharePoint and Teams to try to identify common mistakes and potential breaches. We also have, of course, we have guest access, which means who are the guests and which guest is being added. And we have the file operations, which means files being downloaded, uploaded, removed, etc. So maybe now is the time to jump into a small demo to show you this, because we have a few different options. One of them by default is that the logging of everything which is in Microsoft 365 is within the Microsoft Unified Audit Log, which will provide all of the logs in your environment. Now, that's a really cumbersome log to look into. It's really slow. I'm not a fan of that. So what I mostly use is Microsoft Sentinel, and that's the SIEM of Microsoft, which will get all of the data in there and have it in an easy, credible way. Of course, Sentinel is not for everybody. It's a different resource you have to set up. In the demo from Syskit, we will also provide an example of how Syskit can be able to help you with these queries, for example, I'm talking about, and provide an easier alternative compared to setting up Sentinel as an entirety. But what you want to showcase is that within Sentinel, we can dive into the logs and we can look into the Office activity. So I just want to showcase this because we go to Office activity and we get, for example, one activity in here. We can see, perfect example, we can see a member role being changed. We will look into this, what is happening here. Let me see. Oh, I see what's happening is that I am being updated as a member with my test account in a specific team. Now, this is just one log. If I remove this, I can see all of the logs in 24 hours. And here we really can see what's happening, which roles are being added, but also if I would have activity on file deletions, I would be able to see what files are being deleted. And what is important is that we start monitoring teams as well and create alerts and incidents based on the behavior happening within that environment. And so this is an example of some incidents which are created based on data from Microsoft Teams. You have to set up your own use cases and know what's happening in your environment. Because if you just set up the environment and you have no idea what's happening, how are you going to secure it? And that's where it's really important to have a monitoring tool in place to make sure that you know exactly what the users are doing and you can spot anomalies. For example, I think everybody knows the unusual volume of file deletion events, which happen a ton in an environment. These are events you should be looking into to see what is this user doing. Is it a cleanup event? Or is somebody trying to breach the environment? And these are all things you should be looking into, because if you don't know what's happening in the environment, you can also not protect the environment. So having an audit log and being able to act upon an audit log and create smart incidents you can respond to is really important. But it all comes down to creating smart incidents. What do I mean by that? The default things which are enabled within Microsoft and Microsoft SharePoint, there are simple rules just stating if Thijs deletes 10 items from his OneDrive, create an incident. The thing is, as somebody who's looking into security, you cannot check every time I'm deleting 10 events, because I might do that every day as part of my work. So you need to be looking into how many documents it stays deleting as an average over the days. And if there's a sudden increase, for example, if I suddenly delete 200 items, you might want to create the incidents. So it's really about creating smart incidents and not putting yourself with a burden on all of that work, because more incidents doesn't mean the better. You have to have it manageable, so that you're aware of these are the important things I should focus on. And you might have 2 or 3 incidents a day, which is manageable because you have the time, you can look into those 2 or 3. But having 200 incidents each day, that's not manageable. So really think about before you start, what do I want to see and what do I want to check and how will I respond to that? You might not care if somebody starts to delete 200 documents, but you might want to look into Teams activity, which is something Sentinel can do as well. And maybe I can even provide an example of that as well to showcase the activity within Teams, because we have certain analytic rules, and these will create incidents based on behavior. I am going to look into some team specific. For example, these is a great one. And let me edit this so I can showcase this to you. This will actually showcase if multiple teams are being deleted by a single user. And this is a great way of creating smart rules that you might want to be notified about. Because if I delete one team, you might not care about that because that's a cleanup action. But if I suddenly start deleting 10 teams or 15 teams, it's maybe something to look into. So the whole goal really is to showcase monitoring is really important, but don't just monitor it for monitoring. Really think about what do I want to see and how do I respond to that. Not create an incident and let it sit there, but an incident is something you should investigate. And it's not because you have 100 incidents a day, you're doing a good job. I'm more like to see you have one incident each day, you investigate it, you manage it, instead of 100 incidents which are just sitting there. Now, we have talked about using multiple things throughout Teams. We have had identity, we have had purview with the labels, we have auditing and the built-in controls. Now, I want to take this all together and really provide you an example of how you can protect a high-value team. What is a high-value team? A high-value team is, for example, the team with all your management. Your management might save important financial information on Teams or HR information, which you surely want to protect. And that is, again, the multi-layered approach I talked about in the beginning, is having the entire stack coming together and protecting that team. Because here, again, we have multiple ways to protect that team, and all will protect a different attack vector. So starting from the left, what do we have is using those labels. With those sensitivity labels for containers, one, we can restrict in that management team. We will not have any guest users joining because it's a management team. They don't need any guest users. Everybody has a user in the team. And then two, we will restrict that it needs to be accessed from a managed device. And that's a device we can secure, we can monitor, and we can make sure that it's safe. So with these labels on our management team, we can make sure that one, not a random guest user will access it, and we can make sure that the devices accessing it don't have a virus or malware installed, so it's safe. Second one next to the labels, of course, is identity. And that's a really big one. And it's all coming together in every security you're talking about. And it also goes into zero trust. Conditional access, which we talked about, setting up a few rules to make sure that we govern the access to a team. Through conditional access, we set up those rules. And we can have a zero trust kind of way where we each time a user comes in, we verify it and we make sure that's actually the user. Now I'm talking about zero trust in brackets. It's something which is often used, and it's for me too often used, and I wouldn't focus on the buzzwords in the marketing all that bad. But I want to showcase that it's really important that you have some set of basic verification in place, not just MFA, not just legacy replication, but making sure where are they storing the data, downloading the data. It's one thing, and for example, those MFA configurations should also be taken into account. So that's again the multi-layered approach, having the identity, making sure the user has a strong password. He is protected with MFA. He's working from a secure, compliant, managed device, and these security settings cannot be updated from anywhere, any place, anytime. Third one is auditing, which is, I think, probably the most forgotten one. Is making sure to see what's happening. You might want to monitor the team of your management additionally, and for example, see for every member which is being added into this team, I want to receive an email notification because then I can check who is being added into that team. Is that somebody I expect, or is it something I don't expect? Because those are the things you might look into and say, okay, suddenly an external user is being added, or somebody from the engineering department is being added. This doesn't make sense. This account might be breached, and might try to exfiltrate data by adding external accounts so that they can access the highly confidential team. So auditing the entire environment, making sure what's happening is really important. But again, it's not only based on the on Teams only, it's based on SharePoint, it's based on identity, making sure that you cover the entire stack, looking into what's happening from the team side, Teams members being added, team owners being added, but also from the SharePoint side, which are the interactions with the files. And then finally, we have the applications being installed. And this is something maybe you can have stricter for your management, is what applications can be added to the team and what is allowed and what isn't allowed. And maybe for this last example, we can again dive into the portal to showcase this a little bit. I will pop up the team. So here we're in the Teams admin center. One thing we can immediately see is who is able to access it externally. And when I'm talking about federation and limiting who you can chat with, here you can say, I want to block all external domains, or I want to allow only specific domains. So if you want to set up federation and limit who your users can chat with, you can add certain domains, for example, from your partners right here. And these are the domains which are allowed to be communicated to. But when we're talking about the apps, which I talked about before, we can go into manage apps. We'll discard those changes. And we can see all of the apps which are available in Microsoft Teams by default. And that's important to know. We have 1,800 applications which are allowed by default. Every application by default is allowed. And I'm not saying that you should block all of these apps or look into those apps individually, but you need to be aware that this is a potential issue, a potential security issue, and you need to be aware of what's happening and which apps are installed. We can easily filter on this, for example, to see which apps are being used and block or allow those users. But for me, what's important is that you just know what the apps are being used, and certainly for those high value, high confidential teams, vet the applications, know what they're doing, and try to limit shadow IT, for example, or external storage providers, which you don't want to have. So to summarize, we saw lots of different things. I didn't talk just about Microsoft Teams. I talked about the entire stack. And for me, security, it's not just one thing. It's looking across the entire environment to make sure you're covering it all. So we have the labels to make sure that we restrict access. We have identity to make sure that the user who is using Teams is actually the user that we know. Auditing means verifying what's happening, spotting anomalies, and make sure that we are aware of certain abnormal behavior happening and we act upon it, because you can create incidents, but you need to act upon it. And then last but not least, we have the entire configuration within Teams, which will, for example, define which applications can be used or can't be used. Now, this was a quick overview of everything which is around Teams. Of course, there's lots of other products, lots of integrations. These were the most important ones for me. What I propose is we right now jump into the demo to see how Syskit can also help to secure the environment, and, for example, audit some of the cases which are talked about. And then we'll come right back for the Q&A to see if any questions have popped up during the webinar. So I want to hand it over to the demo to showcase what Syskit can do from you.
Well, Thank you, Thijs, for this awesome presentation. And just for the rest of you guys, remember everyone submit any questions you have for Thijs for our Q&A session later on. So please don't be shy. But before that, like Thijs mentioned, we are going to turn things over to Syskit's engineering team lead Hrvoje for a quick demo on how Syskit Point can help you secure your M365 environment. Hrvoje, are you ready?
Yeah, thank you, Ivan, for the nice introduction. And let me start by sharing my screen. Yeah, so hopefully now you can see it. So thank you, Thijs, for the great presentation. And let's just go to Syskit Point and see how it can help you achieve some of those things Thijs talked about. So first of all, Syskit Point is a governance and security tool that's going to help you with your governance and security needs, you know. Let's start by just taking these sensitivity labels as some of kind of starting point. Syskit Point is a great reporting tool to help you with just getting reports and auditing what's going on inside of your environment. So we're going to start with sensitivity labels. This is an example of an environment where everything is already set up, and now I'm just checking out if everything is going as I want to. There's an easy way here to just check what are these highly confidential, or in my case, confidential sites. Okay, so now it's filtered, and I'm just gonna filter by Microsoft Teams. As you can see, Syskit Point is not gonna show you only Microsoft Teams. We are also showing 365 groups, SharePoint sites, and OneDrives. So we are monitoring all of those. So for example, here I see all the list of Microsoft Teams with the confidential label applied to it. This usually means that these are really important to me, and I would like to keep a better check on them. So if I select them all, I can just drill down into some of these interesting reports that we're gonna show you. So for example, let's start with externally shared content here. So I can see in this example, what kind of external sharing do I have actually on these sites, since sensitivity labels are not configured correctly here. But you can get a better idea of what's going inside of this. So as I can see, executive authority has a couple of external users directly inside of the group. So this may be some kind of a issue for you, and you should be able to have something to do about it with these kind of reports. And down here, I even have sharing links that anybody with the sharing link to this analysis can edit it. So this can be also a problem for you. So you can just select this and just delete unique permissions from this document. And in that way, you're just resetting the permissions and canceling the sharing. So you can do a lot of these management actions just from the Syskit Point. So this is one example I wanted to show you how you can leverage our nice reporting. The other way that we can do here is that we can export these kind of views. So let's now look how that looks in action. So you can export it, and when you have exported, we usually recommend the Excel export, because you can just show it nicely inside a table here, and then I can just use sensitivity labels here and just select those that do not have sensitivity labels. And if I go here, I'm going to see the finance. Finance team does not have confidential sensitivity label, and this is usually somewhere where I would want to apply it. So this is something that you can do with our tool and without our reporting. So this is just a couple of basic things, and this is when we are talking about the already existing Microsoft Teams and SharePoint sites and everything else. Syskit Point can help you also with the provisioning part. So something that starts on the beginning of the life cycle of a team. So you can use our provisioning engine to make sure that the confidential sensitivity label is applied on the beginning of the creation. So there is no time anywhere in the life of the team that it does not have sensitivity label. So if I go here to my confidential internal project, I can set it up in such a way. So you're going to see a lot of different options here. I don't have time now to go through everything, but if you want to see a full demo of this, just please reach out to us. But let's just go here. As you can see, there's the sharing settings, and you can set up all these different things. But these sensitivity labels here are really important, because you know that when your end users create these teams through Syskit Point provisioning, these teams are going to have this sensitivity label applied. And then we also have this really nice feature where you can make this template available, for example, only to cash and finance teams. In such a way, you are ensuring that only people who needs to create these kind of teams can actually create them. So you have a lot of these options inside of our provisioning. So in that sense, I hope I showed you how you can use sensitivity labels in the environment that is already set up, and you're just starting to use sensitivity labels to secure your environment, and then you're also doing it from the beginning. The other thing that I wanted to just quickly jump into it, and it's always nice to do it from this interface, I guess, is just going over these activities on these kind of sites. So I'm also going to select everything, and then I can see all the permission changes. And this is really important because you can see how if somebody changed the permissions for these groups, and this is where you can intercept if somebody has been adding users to these groups that should not be there. So let's see here. So somebody was removed from this team, and somebody was added, and you can have a nice report here. And the great thing about Syskit Point is that you can schedule all these reports so you can receive them on some kind of a weekly, monthly basis, so you can just be reminded of it from time to time. So this is one, I would say, way so you can proactively monitor, but there is another way that you can proactively monitor, and I like it even more, is the alerting features. So if I go here and if I select them all, I can, no, let's do it like this. So I can just use this site and I can configure alerts for this site. So alerts are really important, and as Thijs already mentioned, you want to be notified when something like this changes. So, and as you know, any owner of the Microsoft team can change sensitivity label on that site, and then you can set up a notification to receive when somebody changes the sensitivity label on that site, because that's gonna change your security and you want to be notified of these events. So you can just set it up here, so Syskit owners or just custom recipients change it, and you can also configure it to see how you want it to be. And there's a lot of these different alerts here. I'm not going to go into it, but most of those are concerned with that that your security is up and running on those sites. So this is one way you can do it, but you can also do it for your whole environment. So if I go here and just add a new alert, these are what we call tenant level alerts, and then we also have sensitivity label changes. So you so you don't need to apply this to any site, because maybe you want to monitor all the tenant, or you can go by these different sites. So let's just jump into the report that Thijs was mentioning about, is the audit logs overview, where you can see all the audit logs in last, let's say, 30 days, but then you can just drill down into what's maybe interesting to you. So we're gonna go for the file and page activities, as though those may be the most interesting for us. So let's go just like this, run report, and I'm gonna get a report of everything that went inside of my environment, and I forgot to turn off user logged in, but this is a way that you can see who's accessing your environment and using our interface that's going to help you. And there's a lot of these different reports that are going to give you more context on what happened. So for the site permissions changes, we saw what happened, and then we also have user activity, where we're going to tell you what one user did in all of your environment. So this is in a way to just be more focused on the content and security, and that is set up in a correct way. And then we also have a configuration inventory, which is a nice way to just see how your environment is set up. So for example, if I go here to security and compliance, I can see all the sensitivity labels I have defined on my environment. And then I can also see different properties of those, and this is basically inventory of your environment. And there's a nice way for you to do is that you can export these settings, and then you can compare them over time. So you see when somebody added a new sensitivity label, or even worse, when somebody deleted a sensitivity label. And as you can see, there's a lot of these different what we call configuration inventory reports, where we're just giving you opportunity to see in one interface all the different reports that go all over the Microsoft 365. So from Azure Active Directory, where you can see, for example, named location for your conditional access, then Intune to see how your Android app, I think I have ISI app protection. So you get a better idea of what's going all around your Microsoft 365 tenant, and you get a full view. So yeah, this was a quick, just quick demo of what Syskit Point can do for you, depending on security and how you can make sure that your environment is more secure. So if you would like to see more, please reach out to us and we can give you a full demo of our tool. So Ivan, that would be all from me. If we have any more questions, just go.
Yeah, well, thank you, Hrvoje. This was a really excellent presentation. I always like hearing you speak and showing us the demo of Point. So now it's time for our Q&A session with Thijs. Thijs, are you ready?
Yes, ready and available.
Okay, so Thijs, we just have a couple of questions. So the first one is, how can we ensure that we don't create end user impact while rolling out the conditional access policies mentioned?
Yeah, and so what is difficult is, for example, you might not be aware who is accessing the MFA configuration from a personal device, and if they might be impacted. And what is really important is looking into the sign-in logs at that time and auditing and querying those sign-in logs. You can do this, for example, through Syskit, through the audit log to see, okay, where the sign is coming from and what activity is happening, but also just using sign-in logs and Azure AD and making sure that you create a filter to really base yourself, what is the activity, where is it happening from, that you know what would be the impact. And then you can really start comparing the business cases for those actions and see if exclusions need to be set up so you don't hinder actual user behavior.
Well, thank you for that, Thijs. We do have another question that just came in as well. So Abidun asked, is there a tutorial video that demonstrates or how can I use SharePoint and Microsoft Teams to store and share data in accordance with security and privacy policies?
I don't have something specific on that. I think that's really a broad term and to look further than just one set of policies. I think that's an entire security configuration which will impact the team's creation, again, the labeling and the entire environment. So I don't think there's an easy answer on that, unfortunately. I think it's looking into what do you have now, what scope do you have, and what is configured in the environment, and see how things can be adapted. If you have, maybe if the person can provide some more clarity or really pointers on what they're looking for, maybe we can have it as a follow-up. But I don't think I can provide one single answer to that.
Yeah, that makes sense, Thijs. So we'll definitely reach out to the person who has the question, and we'll let you know. And the last question, since we are a bit short on time, so do you have any tips for starting off with the sensitivity labels for containers?
I would say start small, not go too big at one time. There's no need to create 50 labels at first and try to have everything in place. I like to start off really small and look into, okay, are there certain teams who have the most confidential information? Like I can imagine at Syskit, there's, for example, R&D teams who have those confidential information. Look into what is really the heart of your environment and look first into that and then move forward. Don't try to get every use case out there and cover everything out there, because you will create such a big implementation that it's so complex for an end user to pick the right label. It's going to be almost impossible. So really start off small, look into the most important use cases and work your way from there.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that, Thijs. Once again, thank you all for joining us on today's webinar. As mentioned, everyone who registered for this event will receive a recording of the webinar. And thanks again to you, Thijs, for joining us today and doing a great presentation. It was a pleasure having you here with us. And Thijs, would you like to say anything before we wrap this up?
just wanted to have a big thank you for those watching, and then for Syskit for inviting me and doing this awesome webinar.
Yeah, well, thank you as well. And to all of you, if you have any further questions regarding Syskit Point or any of our products, please reach out to us at sales@syskit.com. It was a pleasure having you all here, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.